Everyone laughed when a poor widow bought an abandoned Mafia mansion for just $100. Neighbors joked that she had brought a curse upon herself. After all, people once disappeared in that house, and weapons were found there. But when the woman opened a hidden room behind the wall, what she saw inside shocked the entire town. Dot. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The rain had stopped just before dawn, leaving the streets of Brookhaven glistening with a thin layer of silver light. It was one of those mornings when the world felt hollow, as if it had been wrung dry of all color and sound. Lydia Moore stood on the cracked steps of her apartment building, clutching a wrinkled newspaper in her hands. Her breath came out in small clouds, dissolving into the chill. The headline that caught her eye wasn't one of tragedy or scandal. It was small, printed near the bottom of the classified section. Penthouse for sale. Large, cheap, urgent. She almost didn't read the address. Her life had been measured in a series of endings lately, and the idea of a beginning, any beginning, felt like an indulgence she didn't deserve. Her husband had been gone for nearly 2 years now, taken in a car accident that also claimed her son and daughter. The doctors said it was a miracle that she survived, but miracles, she had learned, often came at the wrong cost. Since then, she had lived like a shadow, moving from job to job, from one temporary room to another, collecting more silence than hope. That morning, something changed. Maybe it was the way the light hit the wet pavement, or the ache of the empty apartment she could no longer afford, or maybe it was the word cheap. She circled the ad with a shaking hand and tucked it into her coat pocket, as if afraid it might vanish. The address led her to the industrial side of the city, a place most people forgot existed. The streets there were wide and strangely quiet, lined with warehouses and crumbling brick buildings that leaned toward one another like weary old men. Her small car trembled as she drove over the uneven asphalt. It was there, behind a set of rusted iron gates, that she saw it for the first time. The house that everyone whispered about. It rose from the ground like a sleeping beast, its stone walls wrapped in ivy, its tall windows black and lifeless. The penthouse once belonged to Domenico Rossini, a name that still made older residents lower their voices. He had been a man of myth and menace, the so-called King of the Northern Quarter, a figure both admired and feared. 20 years ago, his empire had crumbled overnight. There were rumors of betrayal, of hidden vaults filled with money, of murders that were never solved. When Rossini disappeared, the city claimed the property, but no one ever dared to live there again. The real estate agent who met her at the gate was a pale, anxious man who kept glancing at his watch. "You're serious about this one?" he asked, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'll warn you, ma'am, it's been empty a long time. Some people say it's cursed." Lydia's voice was calm, almost detached. "I don't believe in curses." He nodded, though his expression said otherwise, and led her through the overgrown driveway. The air smelled of damp leaves and cold stone. When he pushed open the front doors, a wave of stale air rushed out, carrying the scent of dust and time. Inside, the place was enormous, far larger than she expected. The main hall stretched upward into shadow, the marble floor cracked in places, but still glinting faintly beneath the dirt. The chandelier above was missing half its crystals, and the staircase that wound upward seemed to disappear into the dark. Yet, even in its decay, there was beauty. The faint remnants of gilded moldings, the hand-carved banisters, the frescoes barely visible beneath layers of grime, all whispered of a grandeur that refused to die. The agent spoke in short bursts, his voice echoing off the walls. 15,000 square feet. 3 floors. There's a lift, though it doesn't work. The plumbing's functional. The roof was patched last year. You can make it livable with a bit of work. How much? Lydia asked. He hesitated. Honestly, the city's been trying to get rid of it for years. It's practically a donation at this point. You'd only need to cover the back taxes and paperwork. He looked at her again, uncertain. No one wants it, Mrs. Moore. They say Rossini buried his sins in these walls. Lydia walked slowly through the hall, running her fingers over the cracked wallpaper. She could almost feel the weight of the years pressing against her skin. Somewhere in her chest, a small ember of defiance stirred. No one wanted this place. But she did. 2 weeks later, the deal was done. Her last savings vanished into signatures and stamps, leaving her bank account nearly empty. When she returned to the penthouse with her few belongings and the 2 children she'd begun fostering through a community program, quiet, wide-eyed twins named Jonah and May, she knew there was no turning back. They arrived at sunset. The iron gates groaned open with the sound of protest, and the tires of her car crunched over the gravel. The house loomed ahead, bathed in orange light. Vines crawled across its walls like veins, and a crow perched on the roof, watching in silence. Jonah leaned forward from the back seat. "It's huge," he whispered. May pressed closer to the window, her small hand gripping the glass. "It looks sad." Lydia smiled faintly, though her heart ached at the truth of it. "Then we'll make it happy again." They stepped out into the overgrown yard, surrounded by weeds taller than the children. The air was heavy with the smell of earth and rust. Inside, dust rose with every footstep, catching the fading light like ash. Furniture covered in white sheets stood like ghosts frozen mid-motion. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily, the only sound in the vast silence. The children stayed close as Lydia moved from room to room, opening shutters and letting the evening spill in. Each door creaked like a memory being disturbed. In the grand hall, she found an old piano with its keys yellowed and broken, a cracked mirror that reflected her face in fragments, and a fireplace filled with cold ashes. She imagined the life that had once pulsed here: music, laughter, arguments, ambition, and how quickly it must have all turned to ruin. That night, they made beds on the floor in what must have once been the library. The children fell asleep almost instantly, exhausted from the move. Lydia lay awake, listening to the sighs of the old house, to the groaning wood and the distant rustle of the wind through the broken windows. She wasn't afraid. There was something strangely peaceful in the emptiness, a promise that perhaps even a place like this could be reborn. In the early hours, she rose and walked through the hall again, her footsteps soft against the cold marble. The moonlight streamed through the tall windows, touching the faded murals of angels and vines along the ceiling. In the reflection of the glass, she thought she saw a shadow move behind her, but when she turned, there was nothing there. Only silence and the faint scent of old perfume. She stood for a long time at the foot of the stairs, gazing upward into the darkness. Somewhere above, the floors groaned, as though the house itself was shifting in its sleep. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps something older still lingered here, waiting. But Lydia didn't turn back. She placed her hand on the railing, feeling the smoothness of the wood beneath the dust, and whispered to the empty air, "We're home now." Outside, the city slept, unaware that within the walls of the house everyone feared a spark of life had returned. The first lights in years flickered on behind cracked windows, faint and trembling, like the heartbeat of something waking after a long, cold silence. And though she didn't know it yet, that decision, to step inside when everyone else turned away, would uncover a story buried beneath decades of lies. A story that would change not only her life, but the very meaning of the name Rossini. The wind rose again, brushing the ivy against the walls like a whisper, and somewhere deep within the house a door clicked shut, as if acknowledging her presence. Morning came gray and silent, and the first light that slipped through the cracked shutters painted everything in pale gold. The air inside the house was cold enough to see one's breath. Lydia woke before the children, her back aching from the hard floor. She sat up slowly, brushing the dust from her coat, and listened to the creaking rhythm of the old penthouse settling into a new day. Somewhere, deep within the walls, pipes clanged faintly, like a heartbeat beneath stone. The house was alive in its own way, old, stubborn, and full of secrets. When she stepped outside onto the terrace, the city stretched far below her in a haze of fog and sunlight. From up there, the industrial quarter looked almost peaceful, but she knew what people were saying down there, beyond those streets. Rumors traveled faster than truth, and in small towns or forgotten corners of big cities, gossip had a life of its own. The news that a destitute widow and 2 foster children had moved into the Rossini mansion was already spreading like wildfire. By noon, the laughter began. It started at the grocery store when she came to buy cleaning supplies. The cashier, a young man with too much time and too little compassion, grinned as he rang up her items. "You're the lady who bought the murder house, right?" he said, his tone bright with mock curiosity. The woman behind her in line snickered, whispering something about ghosts with Italian accents. Lydia kept her eyes on the counter and said nothing. She had no interest in defending herself to people who had already decided what to believe. On the walk back, she passed 2 teenage boys filming on their phones near the gate. They laughed loudly, pointing toward the overgrown lawn. One of them shouted, "Hey, Miss Rossini, hear any screams at night yet?" The other doubled over in laughter. She ignored them, though her face burned. She'd dealt with ridicule before. Whispers about bad luck, about how tragedy followed her. People always needed something to fear or mock. Now she had given them both. Inside the house, the children were exploring. Jonah had found a cracked mirror in one of the upstairs bedrooms where vines had pushed through the open window and crawled across the walls like veins. May was sitting on the floor near an old trunk filled with yellowed linens and faded dresses. "It smells like old flowers," she said softly. Lydia smiled faintly. "That's exactly what it smells like, something that used to be alive." They worked together that day, clearing the main hall of debris. Dust rose in thick clouds, dancing in the shafts of sunlight that cut through the dirty windows. Underneath the grime, the house began to reveal hints of its former grandeur. A carved banister with angels along the edges, a marble floor veined with blue and gold, and remnants of a mural above the fireplace, a woman holding a laurel wreath, her eyes half closed in sorrow. It was beautiful, even in decay, but the laughter outside didn't stop. Each day brought a new insult, a new visitor who came only to stare. A local paper ran a small column. "Widow moves into mobster mansion. Bravery or madness?" Lydia read it once, folded it neatly, and burned it in the fireplace. The children saw her do it and said nothing. They seemed to understand that fire was sometimes the only proper answer. Nights were the hardest. The house groaned as if remembering things it wished to forget. Some rooms stayed colder than others, as though time itself had frozen there. Once, in the kitchen, she found footprints in the dust that didn't belong to any of them. Small, bare prints, as if a child had walked through sometime in the past. May refused to sleep alone after that. They moved their makeshift beds together in the library near the old piano, where the faint light from the hallway gave them a sense of safety. Still, Lydia refused to be frightened. Fear, she thought, was a luxury of people who had something left to lose. What terrified her more was the idea of doing nothing, of giving up again, of drifting through another year without purpose. The house, despite its decay and reputation, gave her something to hold on to. Each nail she hammered back into place, each window she cleaned, each corner she swept. It all felt like an act of defiance against the cruel indifference of the world. She began to notice strange things among the remains of the Rossini family. In one of the bedrooms, hidden behind a wardrobe, she found a stack of black and white photographs, weddings, christenings, holidays. In the images, Domenico Rossini was not the cold-eyed criminal from the newspapers. He was a father, smiling as he lifted his little girl into the air, a man holding his wife's hand at a summer picnic. The photos were dusty and brittle, but the joy in them was unmistakable. That discovery stayed with her for days. She kept the photographs in a small wooden box and sometimes looked at them before bed, studying the faces, trying to see beyond the headlines. The more she stared, the less she could reconcile the man in the pictures with the monster people spoke of. Perhaps, she thought, the truth had been more complicated. Perhaps all monsters were, once, just people who had lost their way. One evening, as she was scrubbing soot from the fireplace, Jonah came running into the room, holding something in his hands. It was a torn piece of newspaper, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Rossini Empire Falls. Authorities seize assets, house sealed." Beneath it was a photo of the mansion in its prime, the same grand staircases and chandeliers now buried beneath years of neglect. Lydia took the scrap and smoothed it carefully across the table. "What happened to him?" Jonah asked. "No one knows," she said quietly. "Some say he fled the country. Others say he was killed by his own men. The police never found a body." May's voice was barely a whisper. "Do you think he was bad?" Lydia hesitated, then shook her head. "I think he was a man who made choices. Some good, some terrible. But I think this house remembers the good ones, too." That night, after the children were asleep, she returned to the room where she had found the photographs. There were more boxes in the closet. Letters, receipts, invitations. She sat on the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of another family's life. The letters were mostly in Italian, written in a flowing, elegant hand. She couldn't read all of them, but a few had been penned in English. One line caught her eye. "They will never let me go, but I will find a way to leave them something pure." She read the line again and again, tracing the ink with her fingertip. Something inside her stirred, a quiet recognition, as if the words had been written for her. The days grew colder, the laughter outside faded a little, replaced by curiosity. A few of the neighbors stopped by with cautious questions, peering through the open gate to catch a glimpse of her progress. One old woman from across the street brought a basket of bread and said she had known Rossini's wife long ago. "She used to feed stray cats by that wall," the woman said, pointing to a crumbling corner of the garden. "People forget she was kind." Lydia thanked her, though she could see pity in the woman's eyes. Everyone thought she was chasing ghosts, that she had lost her mind along with her fortune. But she no longer cared what they thought. Every day she uncovered something new, an old toy, a faded portrait, a cracked glass of wine still standing on a shelf like a relic of a life interrupted. Each object whispered a fragment of a story, and she felt compelled to piece it together. The house itself began to feel less hostile. When the wind blew through the broken windows, it sounded less like mourning and more like breath. The creaks in the floor became familiar, almost comforting. She started leaving the hallway lights on at night, soft and golden, so the darkness would never be absolute. One evening, after a long day of cleaning, she stood in the center of the grand hall and looked up at the painted ceiling. Dust swirled in the lamplight, and for the first time she could see the faint outlines of cherubs and flowers that had been hidden under grime. She felt an ache in her chest, part sadness, part awe. "We're bringing you back," she whispered. "Slowly, but we are." Outside, a car passed by, its headlights sweeping across the windows. For a brief second, her reflection in the glass seemed to blur with another figure, a tall man in an old-fashioned suit standing beside her. She blinked, and the figure was gone. Maybe it had been a trick of light. Or maybe it was the house reminding her that she wasn't truly alone. That night, she dreamt of laughter echoing through the halls. Not the cruel laughter of the townspeople, but something softer, warmer. A man's voice, a woman's, children running up the stairs. When she woke, the air smelled faintly of perfume and dust, and she could have sworn she heard a piano key hum under her fingertips when she passed it. The world outside still mocked, still doubted, but inside the house something was changing. The silence no longer pressed down like a weight. The shadows no longer frightened her. She had begun to see the mansion not as a tomb of sin, but as a wounded body that could heal. And in that healing, perhaps she would find her own. The next morning, as she stepped outside to hang sheets in the brittle winter sun, a boy on a bicycle shouted from the street, "Hey, lady, they say that house eats people." His laughter trailed behind him as he sped away. Lydia smiled faintly and called after him, her voice steady and calm. "Then it must be very hungry. Don't get too close." For the first time in years, her laughter was genuine. The house didn't scare her. The past didn't scare her. She was beginning to understand that fear only belonged to those who looked away. She wasn't looking away anymore. She was looking deeper. And beneath the layers of dust, beneath the laughter and mockery, something was waiting. A story that the walls had guarded for decades. A truth that would soon reveal itself to the one person brave enough to listen. By the time the first snow arrived, the house no longer felt like a stranger. The laughter and gossip outside had dulled to an occasional whisper, and the children had grown accustomed to the creaks and sighs of the old structure. Every morning, Lydia would wake to the sound of wind brushing through the cracked shutters and the muffled hum of the city far below, and for a fleeting moment, she could almost believe they had always belonged here. The mansion had stopped resisting them. It was still old, still scarred, but it had grown quiet, as if it were watching, waiting to see what they might uncover. Winter light had a way of softening even the harshest edges, and it filled the rooms with a fragile glow that made the dust seem almost beautiful. Lydia spent her days cleaning, repairing, and exploring. She moved methodically from one room to another, sweeping out the past a handful of dust at a time. The air was heavy with the smell of old wood and forgotten lives, and every drawer or wardrobe she opened seemed to hold echoes of something human. Letters, handkerchiefs, photographs, perfume bottles half full of amber liquid that still carried a faint sweetness after all those years. It was on one such morning, while she was clearing debris from the upstairs hall, that she noticed something odd about the far wall behind an old oak cabinet. The wallpaper there was newer than in the rest of the corridor, its color slightly brighter, its pattern misaligned. She ran her fingers over it and felt a ridge where there shouldn't have been one. The cabinet, impossibly heavy, had clearly not been moved in years. Jonah, who had been sweeping the floor nearby, watched as she frowned. "Help me push this," she said quietly. Together, they leaned their weight against the furniture until it scraped slowly aside, revealing a rectangle of brickwork that didn't belong. The bricks were uneven and crumbling, and in the faint light from the window, Lydia could see where the mortar had been patched hastily, as though someone had wanted to hide something rather than repair it. She hesitated. Her hands trembled as she brushed away the dust. The house had been strange, yes, but never hostile. And yet, something about that sealed space made the back of her neck prickle. Still, she fetched a small hammer and began to chip away. The sound echoed through the hall like faint gunfire, sharp and hollow. Behind the first few bricks was darkness, and within that darkness the faint glint of metal. When she finally widened the hole enough to reach in, her fingers touched cold iron, a box sealed with a rusted lock. She pulled it free, coughing as a cloud of ancient dust rose around her. Jonah leaned closer, eyes wide. "Is it treasure?" he asked, half in jest, half in hope. Lydia didn't answer. Her breath came in small, shallow bursts. The box was heavy, too heavy for something empty. That night, when the children were asleep, she brought it down to the kitchen table. The single light above cast long shadows across the room as she pried the lock open with the edge of a chisel. The hinges groaned, and inside she found not gold or jewels, but a collection of papers bound together with a leather strap. There were photographs, too, black and white, faded, curled at the edges, and beneath them a small brown notebook, its cover worn smooth by time. The photographs were not what she expected. Some showed a family gathered in gardens and terraces she recognized, the same house, but alive with color and laughter. A man stood among them, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face both kind and weary. His arm was around a woman in a summer dress, their children playing in the background. On the back of one picture was a date, 1959, and a name written in delicate cursive, Maria, my heart. Lydia turned to the notebook. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, and faintly slanted to the right. The first page began simply, "For those who will never know the truth." She read slowly, piecing together the words by the flicker of the dim light. The writer spoke of business, of betrayal, of a man trapped between loyalty and conscience. He wrote of the life he had built through crime and fear, and how, after the death of his wife, he could no longer stomach the world he had helped create. He confessed to laundering money through the city's projects, not for greed, but to fund something he called La Casa de Luz, the House of Light. Page after page, the story unfolded like a confession to no one. He wrote about his associates, their threats, his decision to break away. "They will never let me go," one line read, "but I must leave them something pure before they erase me." Lydia's fingers shook as she turned the pages. Each word felt alive, as if the house itself had been waiting for her to find them. She read until dawn. By the time the first light touched the windows, she had learned that Domenico Rossini, the feared king of the city's underworld, had once tried to redeem himself. He had hidden away money, perhaps millions, to build homes for orphans and children of the poor. He had written letters to city officials, drafted plans, even contacted a charity that never received his donations because he vanished before they could be sent. The rest of the notebook trailed off abruptly after a final entry. "If I disappear, they will say I ran, but I go to meet my reckoning, not to flee it." Lydia sat there for a long time, the notebook open before her, her thoughts spinning. The world outside believed the house cursed, haunted by the sins of its owner, but here in her hands was something different, evidence of regret, of humanity. She thought of the photograph she'd found weeks earlier, the family smiling in the garden. Perhaps it hadn't been evil that built this house, but love, twisted by the weight of wrong choices. When Jonah came downstairs, rubbing his eyes, he found her still sitting there. "Did you stay up all night?" he asked. Lydia smiled faintly. "I suppose I did." She pushed the photographs toward him. These were his family. He wasn't only what they said he was. The boy studied the pictures, then looked at her. "So, he wanted to do something good?" "Yes," she said softly, "but maybe it was too late for him to finish it." That day, the house seemed different. The air felt lighter, almost forgiving. As Lydia moved through the rooms, she could no longer see only decay. She saw traces of lives lived in love and despair. In the ballroom, sunlight spilled through tall windows, catching motes of dust that hung like stars. On the walls, where grime had once obscured the frescoes, faint colors began to emerge, pale blues and golds, scenes of harvest, of children laughing beneath olive trees. May, who had been helping to clean the study, called for her mother. "Mama, come see." On the desk lay another letter, half buried under old receipts. The envelope was addressed simply, "To whoever finds this home." Lydia hesitated before unfolding it. The ink had faded, but the words were clear. A house is not cursed by what it has seen, only by those who forget to forgive it. If this place survives, let it be a shelter, not a tomb. She read the letter aloud to the children, her voice trembling. When she finished, silence filled the room. Jonah's face was thoughtful. "Do you think that's why we're here?" he asked quietly. Lydia didn't answer immediately. She walked to the window and looked out at the snow beginning to fall, coating the ruined garden in white. The question echoed in her mind long after the children had gone back to their chores. That evening, she returned the notebook to the metal box, but she couldn't bring herself to hide it again. Instead, she placed it on the mantelpiece in the main hall. It belonged there, among the remnants of the past. She imagined the ghost of Domenico Rossini walking those same halls, burdened by guilt yet dreaming of redemption, and she felt an unexpected kinship. Perhaps every soul who had lived in that house had been seeking the same thing: peace, forgiveness, a chance to start again. But even as hope began to grow, there was unease. The discovery had awakened something, not a presence exactly, but an awareness. Some nights, when the fire burned low, Lydia could swear she heard faint footsteps overhead, though the children were asleep. Once, while cleaning the library, she found a fresh fingerprint in the dust on the piano lid. The house was remembering, reaching out. She wasn't afraid, not anymore, but she knew that every revelation carried a shadow, and every secret had its price. Still, she couldn't stop now. She began cataloging the documents, translating what Italian she could, and noting the dates. She wanted to understand the man behind them, to trace the path from crime to repentance. In doing so, she realized she was tracing her own. The more she read, the more she felt that she, too, was being rebuilt, brick by brick, word by word. The snow outside thickened into a storm that night, blanketing the city in silence. The wind howled through the chimneys, and the old house shuddered as if stirring from a long sleep. Lydia sat by the fire, the notebook open once more, and whispered to the flickering flames, You tried to make something good. Maybe it's not too late." Upstairs, the children slept soundly. The laughter of the outside world had faded entirely now. No one came to mock or to stare. The mansion had reclaimed its solitude. In that quiet, Lydia felt the first real sense of belonging she had known in years. The house was no longer merely a refuge, it was becoming something else, something sacred. As the storm raged outside, she imagined the ghosts of the Rossini family moving through the halls, not in menace but in peace, their faces soft with gratitude. The walls no longer seemed to weep. The air no longer carried the weight of accusation. Only memory remained, heavy yet pure. And somewhere in that vast, ancient house, buried behind yet another wall she had not yet found, something else waited, something that would show her just how much of Domenico Rossini's dream still lived on. The house had begun to trust her, to reveal itself one layer at a time. But for every truth it gave her, it demanded courage in return. When she finally extinguished the fire and climbed the stairs, she paused halfway up and looked back over the hall. The notebook on the mantel glowed faintly in the dying embers, like a heart still beating after death. She smiled to herself. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "we'll see what else you've been hiding." And the house, as if in answer, settled with a soft, echoing sigh. The morning after the snowstorm, the world outside was still and pale, wrapped in the hush that follows a long night of wind. Inside the mansion, the silence had weight, a stillness that felt more like listening than emptiness. Lydia moved through the hallways with her breath visible in the cold air, the boards creaking softly beneath her boots. The fire from the night before had died to ash, but the memory of what she had read still burned quietly within her. The notebook and letters she had discovered had rewritten the story of this place. The house was no longer the ruin of a monster. It was the unfinished work of a man who had tried to redeem himself. Jonah and May were already awake, bundled in mismatched sweaters, their cheeks pink from the chill. They had begun to treat the mansion like an endless adventure, exploring each dusty corridor and echoing room as if the building itself were a sleeping kingdom waiting to be reawakened. It was Jonah who found the clue that would change everything. He had been playing with a small metal ball he'd found in the old study, a paperweight heavy and smooth, and it rolled across the floor until it struck a section of wall beneath a window with a dull, hollow sound. "Mama," he called. "It sounds funny here." Lydia was nearby, sorting old linens in a chest. She rose, wiping her hands on her skirt, and came to where he knelt. She knocked once, then again, and froze. It was unmistakable. The echo that came back was not the solid thud of plaster, but the empty ring of space behind. Her pulse quickened. "Get me the screwdriver," she said quietly. Jonah obeyed at once. Together they pried away a loose panel, revealing the corner of a heavy metal door embedded deep within the wall. It was square, about 3 feet across, with a tarnished handle and a dial lock. Dust clung to it like age-old secrecy. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The safe looked ancient, immovable, and utterly silent. Its presence filled the room. May appeared at the doorway, clutching her doll. "What is it?" Lydia glanced back at her. "Something Mr. Rossini didn't want anyone to find." The rest of that day passed in restless anticipation. The discovery of the safe had stirred something in all of them: excitement, fear, and curiosity that bordered on awe. They cleaned around it carefully, brushing away cobwebs and debris, tracing the faint engravings on its steel surface. The numbers on the dial had long since worn away, and the handle refused to budge. The air in the room grew heavy with the sense of being close to something vast and long hidden. That night, after the children were asleep, Lydia sat before it in the dim light of a lantern. Her breath clouded the air as she examined the mechanism. The dial had no numbers, only faint grooves where they once had been. The keyhole was rusted, but she could tell it had not been forced. Whatever was inside, it had been sealed intentionally. She thought of the final entries in Rossini's notebook, the way he wrote about his fear that his enemies would erase him before he could set things right. If he had hidden something here, perhaps it was proof of his intentions, or even the fortune he had meant to leave behind. She tried combinations at random, listening to the faint clicks, counting under her breath. The safe remained still, its secrets locked tight. When she finally gave up, it was nearly dawn and her fingers were numb from cold. She leaned back, rubbing her eyes, and whispered into the silence, "You wanted to do good, then help me find the way." 2 days passed before she found the clue. While organizing the papers she had pulled from the sealed box earlier, she noticed a small card tucked inside one of the envelopes, a child's birthday invitation written in delicate handwriting. Julia turns 7. March 14. The date caught her attention immediately. March 14th. The same number appeared several times in Rossini's notes, often next to references to the project and the fund. Her pulse quickened. She returned to the safe and set the dial with deliberate care. 314. The lock resisted for a moment, then clicked. A sound so small, so sharp, it might have been a breath drawn after decades of silence. The door creaked open. Inside was darkness and the faint scent of paper and metal. Lydia's heart pounded. She reached in carefully and withdrew a stack of documents wrapped in oilcloth. Beneath them lay a smaller iron box and a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied with twine. She carried everything to the table, lighting an extra candle. The documents were official, stamped with seals and signatures, bank statements, legal filings, and notarized forms, all bearing Rossini's name. There were transfer records to accounts labeled Casa de Luz Trust. Her eyes widened as she read the totals, figures so large they barely made sense to her. Millions, spread across several institutions, frozen after his death. Attached to the papers was a letter addressed to the custodian of the estate, explaining that the money was to be released only for the creation of a children's home, in partnership with the city council. The letter bore 3 signatures, one of which was Rossini's. Lydia's hands trembled as she held it. The truth of his last intentions was right there, preserved in ink. He had planned to give everything away, to build something pure from a life of corruption. In the smaller box, she found personal items, a silver cross, a photograph of a woman and 2 children, and a folded note that simply said, "Forgive me." She sat there for a long time, the candle burning low, the house utterly still, and she began to laugh softly, not out of joy, but disbelief. For years, this house had been whispered about as a place of darkness, a tomb of crime and greed, and yet here, in her hands, was proof that its master had wanted to leave behind light. In the days that followed, she could think of little else. She reread the letters, memorized the dates, and began piecing together the timeline. The funds had been frozen when the government seized Rossini's assets. His associates had vanished or been imprisoned, and his name had been buried under scandal. But if she could prove the authenticity of these documents, perhaps the trust could still be honored. Perhaps the dream he died for could finally live. She began making calls, timid at first, to the city's archives and records office. Most of the people she spoke to dismissed her immediately, assuming she was another scavenger chasing rumors of hidden Mafia gold. But she persisted. One clerk referred her to an older attorney who had once handled property disputes for the state. His name was Howard Caldwell, and his voice over the phone was dry but curious. "If you've really got Rossini's trust documents, Mrs. Moore," he said, "that would be quite the story. But I hope you understand what kind of ghosts you're waking." When she met him a few days later, she brought a small folder of copies. Caldwell examined them with a magnifying glass, silent for a long time. Then he leaned back and said quietly, "These are real, or very, very good forgeries." He paused, glancing at her. "If you're serious about this, I can request an archival verification. It'll take time, and the authorities won't like being reminded of this case." "I'm not looking for trouble," she said softly. "I just want to do what he couldn't." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. That's what he said too, according to the papers. The process that followed was slow and full of resistance. Weeks passed in a blur of signatures, stamps, and official suspicion. Some days she felt as though she were shouting into a void, watched by people who thought her naive or insane. But she had found a strange new strength in herself. Every time she entered an office or sent another letter, she felt the weight of the mansion at her back, the silent approval of its unseen witnesses. One evening, while she was sitting by the fire sorting through yet another pile of documents, Jonah asked quietly, "Do you think they'll give you the money?" Lydia smiled faintly. "It isn't for me, sweetheart. It's for the house, for him, for everyone who was forgotten." May looked up from her sketchbook. "Then it's like he's helping us from heaven?" "Maybe," Lydia said. "Or maybe he's just helping us from his past." The weeks stretched into months. Winter faded, and the garden outside began to thaw. Birds returned to the eaves, and the air grew softer. Then, one morning in the early spring, a letter arrived bearing an official seal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The words blurred as she read them. "The authenticity of the documents has been verified. The trust known as Casa de Luz may be restored to its intended purpose under supervision of a designated trustee." Lydia sank into a chair, the letter pressed against her chest. The children crowded around her, their eyes wide. "What does it mean?" Jonah asked. "It means," she said slowly, smiling through tears, "that we can finally finish what he started." That night, she placed the silver cross from the safe on the mantel beside the notebook. The flames in the fireplace flickered brighter, casting their light across the hall. She could almost imagine the spirit of the house stirring, recognizing the fulfillment of a promise it had waited half a century to keep. The safe stood open in the wall, no longer a symbol of greed but of redemption. And in its emptiness, Lydia saw something that filled her with quiet awe, a space that had once held secrets now holding possibility. She didn't yet know what the next step would look like, only that it would be difficult, that there would be opposition, disbelief, perhaps even danger. But she was no longer the frightened widow who had moved into a haunted mansion. She had become the keeper of a legacy, the guardian of a man's last hope for forgiveness. And as the firelight shimmered across the walls, it seemed to her that the entire house exhaled in relief, as though it too had been waiting for this moment to breathe again. Outside, the snow melted into rivulets that trickled down the old stone steps, carrying the winter away. The mansion, long silent, had begun to awaken to life, and beneath the faint hum of the wind, Lydia thought she heard a voice, calm, distant, and filled with gratitude, whispering from the depths of the house, "Thank you." Spring arrived shyly that year, hesitant and pale, as if the world itself were uncertain whether it should begin again. The heavy snow that had blanketed the streets for months melted into rivulets that ran down the curbs, filling the air with the scent of wet stone and thawing earth. In the garden behind the mansion, tufts of green began to pierce through the frost-bitten soil, and the ivy that clung to the outer walls stirred as if waking from a long sleep. Inside, the sound of hammers and brushes replaced the echo of silence. Workers moved through the halls, patching plaster, restoring wiring, and carrying out debris that had lain untouched for decades. It was the first time in half a century that the house felt truly alive. Lydia stood in the foyer one afternoon, watching the light from the tall windows break into shards across the polished floor. The safe in the wall, now empty, remained open as if a wound had healed but left its scar visible. The letter from the state rested in a frame on the mantel beside Rossini's notebook and the silver cross she had found within the vault. Those objects had become her compass. Every decision she made now revolved around the promise they represented, to fulfill the dream that had died with him. Word of the rediscovered trust spread quickly. What had begun as a curious story in a small-town newspaper soon grew into something larger. Reporters began calling, some from other cities, some from abroad. They wanted to know about the widow who had moved into a Mafia mansion and uncovered a fortune meant for charity. They wanted photographs, interviews, sound bites. For every article that called her courageous, there were two that called her delusional. The headlines varied between "Widow Redeems Mob Legacy" and "Haunted House Hoax." At first, she tried to ignore the attention. She refused to speak to the media, believing that the documents and the work ahead would speak for themselves. But curiosity has a way of drawing light to the places that most wish to remain dim. Within a week, cameras appeared at the gates, and strangers loitered outside, taking pictures through the iron bars. Children on their way to school stopped to stare, whispering to each other before running off. Some days, Lydia felt like an intruder in her own home again, as if the ghosts she had learned to live with were now joined by the ghosts of gossip and doubt. Then came the first anonymous letter. It arrived folded in an unmarked envelope with no return address. The handwriting was uneven, pressed hard into the paper, the ink smudged by what looked like a thumbprint. It said only, "Leave it buried, Mrs. Moore. You don't know what you've touched." There was no signature. She tore it in half and threw it into the fire, but her hands trembled as she did so. More letters followed. Some were threatening, others pleading. A few were cryptic, filled with fragments of old names and warnings about debts that should never be reopened. One morning, she found the words, "You're digging your own grave," scrawled in chalk on the gate. The children didn't see it. She wiped it away before they left for school, but it left a coldness in her that didn't fade easily. Howard Caldwell, the lawyer, wasn't surprised when she told him. He sat back in his chair, folding his hands. Rossini's enemies didn't vanish, Mrs. Moore. They simply grew old. Some of them had families, legacies. Money has a long memory, and people don't like being reminded that their fortunes were built on corruption. "I'm not after their money," she said quietly. "I just want to use what was meant to be used." He gave her a long, measured look. "That's exactly what makes you dangerous." The city's investigation into the Rossini Trust took months. Each week brought new paperwork, new demands, new interviews. Inspectors came to examine the property. Reporters returned for follow-up stories, and bureaucrats combed through the files with suspicion sharpened by pride. It became clear that some in power would rather the story had stayed buried. The idea that a woman, an outsider, poor and widowed, could stumble upon something so significant offended the delicate hierarchy of those who thought history was theirs to control. But not everyone opposed her. A quiet current of support began to form among the townspeople. The old woman from across the street who had once brought her bread came again, this time with flowers. She told Lydia that she had known Rossini's daughter when they were young. She used to say her father was a good man who made bad choices, the woman said softly. People forget that goodness can hide under terrible mistakes. Volunteers began to appear, some curious, others genuinely moved by the story. They offered to help clean, paint, repair. Among them were former construction workers, students, even a retired carpenter who had once built furniture for the Rossini family. "It's strange to be back here," he said as he sanded the banister. "The boss paid well, treated us with respect. He wasn't the devil they made him out to be." Despite the growing goodwill, the undercurrent of menace never completely vanished. More than once, Lydia caught sight of unfamiliar cars parked across the street, engines idling. Once, she found the padlock on the garden shed broken, though nothing seemed stolen. Another time, she heard footsteps on the gravel late at night and saw a flashlight sweep across the lower windows. She began sleeping lightly, keeping a phone by her bedside and a kitchen knife within reach. The house, which had become her sanctuary, was once again surrounded by invisible eyes. One evening, while sorting through yet another stack of correspondence from the city, she heard glass shatter in the main hall. The children were upstairs, already in bed. She froze for a moment, then moved quietly toward the sound. The moonlight through the tall windows illuminated a single stone lying among shards of broken glass on the floor. Wrapped around it was a piece of paper. Her hands shook as she unrolled it. "Stop digging. This is your last warning." For a long moment she stood there, her breath trembling in her throat. Then she walked to the fireplace, threw the note into the flames, and watched it curl to ash. She didn't call the police. They would only tell her what she already knew, that this was what happened when you stirred the ashes of old crimes. But she refused to be frightened into silence. The next morning, she took the children's hands and led them into the living room. "Do you remember what I told you about Mr. Rossini?" she asked. "That he wanted to make things right," Jonah said. May nodded. "And that we're helping him." "Then we keep going," Lydia said, "no matter what anyone says." That day, she did something she had been avoiding. She spoke publicly. A local journalist who had been respectful in earlier visits asked if she would like to share the true purpose of her efforts. She agreed. The interview took place in the front parlor, where the afternoon sun fell across the walls and made the air shimmer with dust. Her words were calm but firm. She spoke of Rossini's notebook, of the trust, of the vision of a home for children who had no one to protect them. "He built a house of power," she said, "but he wanted it to become a house of mercy. I believe that intention still matters." The story went viral within days. People across the country began sending letters, not threats this time, but messages of encouragement. Some donated small amounts of money. Others offered materials or labor. A group of university students offered to create an online campaign to raise awareness about the project. For the first time, the laughter that had once followed her name was replaced by admiration. But light, once lit, often casts deeper shadows. The night after the article appeared, the phone rang while she was washing dishes. When she answered, there was silence on the other end, just breathing. Then a low male voice said, "You think you're saving him? You're just rewriting lies." The line went dead. Her heart pounded. She stared at the receiver for a long time before placing it back. In that moment, she understood that truth was dangerous, not because it destroyed, but because it forced others to see what they had tried so long to forget. Howard Caldwell called the next morning. "The review board met yesterday," he said, his voice almost disbelieving. "They've agreed to release a portion of the funds for the restoration of the property, on a provisional basis. You did it, Mrs. Moore." Lydia sank into a chair, gripping the edge of the table. "It's real? As real as anything that ever came out of that man's past," he said. "But tread carefully. There will be people who won't forgive you for succeeding." That night, she stood in the foyer again, where the safe still yawned open in the wall. The wind moved through the broken upper windows, carrying the faint scent of rain. She could hear the children laughing upstairs, their voices echoing against the marble. For the first time in years, the sound didn't feel out of place. The mansion was beginning to accept joy again. Later, as she prepared for bed, she stopped by the mantel where the notebook lay. The candlelight caught the edge of its worn cover. She opened it to the first page and read the familiar line, "For those who will never know the truth." She smiled faintly. "We know it now," she whispered. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon, but the fear that once came with storms no longer reached her. The house had weathered worse, and so had she. What frightened her now was not danger, but the weight of purpose, the knowledge that she was carrying something larger than herself, something that had waited half a century to breathe again. In the weeks that followed, construction crews returned, this time paid through the newly released trust funds. They patched roofs, replaced windows, and restored the marble stairs that led to the second floor. Each nail driven into the walls seemed to echo with approval. Volunteers continued to arrive, some bringing food, others helping to clean the garden. The laughter of workers mixed with the calls of birds nesting in the ivy. The mansion no longer looked haunted, it looked alive. One afternoon, when the sun dipped low and turned the halls gold, a young reporter asked her if she ever felt that Rossini's ghost watched over her. Lydia smiled. "Maybe," she said, "but I don't think he's haunting the place. I think he's finally resting." That night, as she walked through the hall before bed, she paused beside the safe. She thought of how it had once held darkness and fear, and now stood empty yet sacred. The air was warm, filled with the scent of fresh paint and plaster. She reached out and touched the cold metal door, whispering, "We did it, Domenico." For a moment, she could have sworn she heard a sigh, soft, almost human, followed by the faintest echo of laughter, the kind that belongs to a man seeing his redemption finally realized. The house fell quiet again, but not the kind of quiet that comes from emptiness. It was the stillness of fulfillment, the silence of peace after confession. Outside, the night settled around the mansion like a benediction, and the stars reflected faintly in the tall windows that now glowed with light. Lydia stood there for a long time, her hand resting on the wall that had once concealed the safe, and thought of how far they had come, from ridicule to purpose, from fear to forgiveness. The past still whispered, but now its voice was gentle, guiding her forward. The ghosts of greed and guilt had given way to the living breath of hope. When she finally turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, the sound of her footsteps mingled with the faint hum of the wind through the rafters. The mansion no longer seemed to mourn its history. It had become something else entirely, a bridge between what was lost and what could still be redeemed. And though Lydia did not see him, she felt certain that Domenico Rossini was somewhere within those walls, watching as his home at last began to become what he had always intended, a sanctuary, not a monument to sin, but a testament to what the heart can repair when it refuses to forget the light. The first true day of spring came with the sound of hammers and the scent of wet plaster. The mansion no longer echoed with emptiness, it throbbed with the rhythm of renewal. The grand hall that had once seemed haunted now rang with laughter and the scrape of ladders as workers painted the tall walls with fresh coats of cream and pale gold. The chandeliers that had hung dim and lifeless were lowered, their crystals polished until they caught every glimmer of light from the afternoon sun. For the first time in decades, the Rossini mansion looked less like a tomb and more like what it had been meant to be, a home. Lydia moved among the workers like a conductor among musicians, her hair tied back, her sleeves rolled, her hands streaked with paint. She gave directions, carried boards, wiped sweat from her forehead, and never once complained. To anyone who passed, she looked like a woman reborn, though only she knew how close she had come to giving up before all this began. The letter that had arrived weeks before, confirming that part of the Rossini trust had been released, still sat on her nightstand, its edges soft from being unfolded so many times. That piece of paper was more than permission. It was vindication. She had fought through laughter, through threats, through the doubt of strangers and the indifference of officials. But now, as the walls were repainted and the floors restored, she saw the tangible result of every sleepless night. The children, Jonah and May, ran through the halls carrying buckets and brushes, pretending to be explorers in some lost palace. Their laughter filled the house, weaving through the noise of the workers, breaking the curse of silence that had hung here for half a century. Each morning began with the same ritual. Lydia would open the tall front doors and let the sunlight flood into the foyer. She said it helped the house breathe. Then she would walk through the rooms one by one, checking progress. The new glass in the windows, the polished banisters, the garden slowly coming back to life. The neighbors, who once whispered, now waved to her as they passed. Some even offered to help. A retired mason came to repair the crumbling garden wall. A group of university students arrived on weekends to plant flowers. What had been called a cursed place was slowly becoming a community effort, a shared redemption. By the end of April, scaffolding surrounded the outer facade, and the once gray stone began to gleam again beneath a gentle layer of new paint. The workers uncovered details no one had noticed before, the carved initials of the Rossini family etched into the arch above the main entrance, tiny cherubs hidden among the ivy design. Lydia traced the letters with her fingers, imagining the hands that had carved them. She could feel the presence of Domenico Rossini everywhere now, not as a ghost, but as a silent witness, watching his dream return to life. The first tangible transformation came in the library. The room had once been heavy with dust and decay, the shelves half collapsed and the ceiling blackened by water damage. Now it was the heart of the house. New wooden shelves rose from floor to ceiling, filled with donated books. The piano, carefully restored, stood by the window. On warm days, May would play scales, her small fingers uncertain but determined, and the sound drifted through the halls like sunlight on water. Sometimes, when Lydia stood listening from the doorway, She imagined another little girl sitting there decades ago, Rossini's daughter, Julia, playing the same notes while her father listened from his study, dreaming of the same laughter that now returned to these walls. Outside, the garden blossomed into color. Wildflowers sprouted where weeds had once ruled, and the fountain at the center of the courtyard, long silent, began to flow again. Lydia had found the broken water pipe herself in the basement, traced it, and ordered a new pump with funds from the trust. When the first jet of water rose and fell in a silver arc under the morning sun, she laughed aloud like a child. The neighbors who had gathered to watch clapped and cheered. The fountain's gentle music became the soundtrack of their afternoons. Still, even amid all the renewal, there were moments when the past reached out. One day, as a worker removed an old panel near the back stairs, a small locked drawer was discovered behind it. Inside was a single item, a child's wooden toy horse, its paint faded, one wheel missing. It was simple, handmade, the kind of thing a father might craft with his own hands. Lydia kept it on the mantel beside Rossini's notebook. It seemed fitting that something born of love, lost in the ruins of crime, should return to light at last. As the weeks passed, the city began to pay attention. Officials who had once dismissed her came to inspect the property, and this time they nodded with approval. The paperwork for the establishment of the new charity foundation, the Casa de Luz home, moved forward faster than anyone had expected. Lydia had chosen the name deliberately, keeping Rossini's own dream intact. "The House of Light," she told the children, because light doesn't erase the past, it makes it visible. By early summer, the first children began to arrive. They came quietly, shy and uncertain, some from temporary shelters, some from families too poor to care for them. Lydia welcomed each one personally, kneeling to meet their eyes, assuring them that this was not another cold institution, but a home. She showed them their rooms, bright, simple spaces with new beds, clean linens, and wide windows that let the morning pour in. Jonah and May took it upon themselves to act as guides, showing the newcomers where the kitchen was, where the library was, where the best hiding spots were when you wanted to be alone, but not too alone. At night, when the halls quieted, Lydia often stood at the top of the stairs, listening. The murmur of voices, the rustle of blankets, the soft laughter that came from behind closed doors. It was the most beautiful music she had ever heard. Once, the only sounds this house knew were those of secrets and fear. Now it breathed with life again. The transformation spread beyond the walls. The locals who had mocked her began to send donations, boxes of clothes, toys, books. One man, whose father had once worked for Rossini, arrived with a van full of furniture. "He wasn't a saint," the man said gruffly as they unloaded tables, "but he wasn't the devil either. My father said he always paid on time, treated his workers with respect. Maybe it's right that his house should do some good at last." Lydia thanked him, her eyes stinging. The same people who once avoided even looking at the mansion now lingered outside its gates, listening to the sounds of children playing in the courtyard. Some evenings, as the sun set, she would see them pause and smile, perhaps realizing that the curse had been nothing more than grief left too long unattended. One afternoon, a city official arrived unannounced with a small team of photographers. They wanted to document the restoration for an upcoming feature about urban renewal. Lydia agreed reluctantly. The photographers moved from room to room, snapping pictures of polished wood and fresh paint, of laughing children and blooming gardens. One of them, a quiet woman with kind eyes, stopped at the mantel where the notebook, cross, and toy horse stood together. "You've kept all this?" she asked. "Yes," Lydia said. "They belong here." The woman nodded. "Most people would have thrown them out." "Then most people would have missed the story," Lydia replied. That evening, after the photographers left, the house seemed unusually still. Lydia sat by the window with a cup of tea, looking out at the courtyard where the fountain glimmered under the moonlight. The water's soft rhythm lulled her thoughts into calm. She thought of her husband, of the life that had been taken from her, of the day she'd first stepped through those doors, carrying nothing but fear and exhaustion. She thought of Rossini, of the man who had built this house out of ambition and lost everything to regret. And she thought of how, somehow, across time and tragedy, their stories had intertwined to create something new. As the days grew longer and the warmth of summer deepened, the mansion settled into its new life. The laughter of children filled every corridor. The scent of bread baking in the kitchen drifted through the halls. The rooms that had once been sealed now stood open, filled with sunlight and color. The ballroom became a dining area. The old study was turned into a classroom. The piano in the library was no longer silent. Sometimes, late at night, when the world outside slept, Lydia would walk through the empty halls, letting her fingers brush the walls as she passed. The house no longer felt cold. It pulsed faintly with warmth, like a living thing. The creaks of the floorboards were not whispers of the dead, but sighs of contentment. In the reflection of the windows, she sometimes imagined she saw faint figures, a man, a woman, a child, watching her with quiet smiles. She never turned to look directly. It was enough to know that the past was at peace. One evening, she gathered the children in the great hall. They stood in a semicircle, faces bright with excitement, as she unveiled the new sign that would hang by the gate. It read, in bold letters, Casa de Luz, a home for every child. The workers cheered, the children clapped, and someone began to play music on the old piano. Lydia stood among them, tears shining in her eyes. The dream that had begun in secrecy and guilt had become a light for others to see. When the last guest left and the children went to bed, Lydia lingered alone in the hall. The sign now hung outside, visible from the street, and the lamp above it cast a golden glow across the gate. She turned to the mantel, where the relics of Rossini's life rested, and whispered, "We kept your promise." The house was silent, but the silence was no longer empty. It was the deep, contented hush that comes when a story finds its ending. Lydia felt the weight of gratitude in the air, as though the walls themselves exhaled. She stood there until the clock struck midnight, the chime echoing softly through the halls, and then she smiled. The mansion had finally become what it was always meant to be, not a fortress of wealth, not a symbol of fear, but a living testament that even the darkest past can be redeemed through compassion. The ghosts had not left, they had simply transformed, their sorrow turned to guardianship. Upstairs, the children slept peacefully, their dreams untroubled. Outside, the fountain whispered under the moonlight, its water catching the reflection of stars. And in that quiet hour, Lydia felt a stillness so complete that it bordered on grace. The house of light had found its heart again, and in its pulse she heard the echo of a truth that would guide her for the rest of her life, that nothing truly dies when love remains to remember it. By late autumn, the air in Brookhaven carried that faint metallic chill that warned of the coming frost. The gardens around the mansion had begun to turn gold and red, and every step across the courtyard made the leaves crackle like faint laughter beneath the children's boots. The Rossini mansion, once a place of shadows and silence, now gleamed softly under the slanted light of shorter days. The fountain still ran, though its edges had begun to ice over at dawn, and smoke curled gently from the chimneys each morning as warmth filled the house within. What had once been a mausoleum of regret was now a living refuge. The Casa de Luz home was fully alive. Lydia stood in the main hall, watching as volunteers carried in boxes of donated coats and blankets. The floor, once cold marble streaked with cracks, was now covered with new rugs sewn by a local craftsman. The walls were hung with drawings, crayon suns, watercolor rainbows, portraits of smiling faces. The children had claimed every corner of the mansion with their joy. Even the quietest of them, who had arrived months ago clutching nothing but a stuffed bear, now laughed freely when she ran down the stairs. The house had become what Rossini dreamed of, a place where the lost could find not just shelter, but belonging. The city had changed its tone as well. What began as a curiosity had become a point of civic pride. The mayor himself had attended the summer opening ceremony, standing awkwardly in front of the cameras and declaring the Casa de Luz a triumph of compassion over legacy. Since then, support had trickled in from unexpected places: businesses, schools, even a few of Rossini's old rivals who had long since outlived their grudges. Some gave quietly, through anonymous donations. Others sent food or toys with handwritten notes. The story of the widow who redeemed the mansion of a Mafia boss had become a symbol of something larger, something that transcended scandal and superstition. But Lydia didn't see herself as a symbol. Her days were filled with practicalities: organizing schedules, teaching lessons, fixing leaks, soothing fears. The children were her world now, and she moved among them like a steady heartbeat, patient and unyielding. Every night, when the halls quieted and the last lamp was dimmed, she still found time to sit by the fire with Rossini's notebook on her lap. Its pages had grown fragile with handling, but she read them anyway, as though afraid the words might vanish if she didn't keep them alive. She no longer read to learn. She read to remember. One passage had always stayed with her. A man cannot undo what he has built in darkness, but he can leave a light behind for those brave enough to carry it. Lydia had carried that light without realizing it, and now, as she looked around her at the world she had helped restore, she wondered whether Rossini's spirit could finally rest. There were still challenges, of course. The trust, though partially restored, was limited, and the mansion required constant upkeep. Bureaucracy remained an obstacle, and there were whispers of new inspections, new conditions. But she faced these things differently now, not with fear, but with quiet resolve. She had learned that goodness was not a single act, but a continuous labor, something one tended daily like a fragile flame. One evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, she received a letter from Howard Caldwell. The envelope bore his careful handwriting, and inside was a single page. "Dear Mrs. Moore," it began, "I thought you should know that the state has completed its review. The remaining portion of the Rossini Trust is to be released in full. You have complete discretion as its executor. I suspect you'll know what to do better than any of us ever could." For a long moment, she simply stared at the words. Then she set the letter down and closed her eyes. The fire crackled softly beside her, casting long, golden shadows across the room. The weight of everything she had endured, every humiliation, every threat, every sleepless night, seemed to fall away in that instant. It wasn't triumph she felt, but peace. The story was closing, not with spectacle, but with grace. The next morning, she gathered the children in the great hall. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon from the breakfast still lingering in the kitchen. Jonah and May sat near the front, their eyes bright with expectation. Lydia held the letter in her hand and read it aloud. When she finished, silence hung in the air for a heartbeat before applause erupted. Small hands clapping, voices cheering, laughter echoing through the vaulted ceiling. "It means we can help more children," Lydia said, smiling through tears. "It means this house will never be empty again." That afternoon, she walked through the garden alone. The leaves had begun to fall in earnest, gathering in golden drifts along the pathways. She paused by the fountain, where the water still shimmered despite the chill, and thought of the journey that had brought her here, from the worn apartment where she'd read that small ad, to the day she first stepped through the ivy-covered gates. The world she'd known then was narrow, filled with sorrow and survival. This place had not just changed her circumstances, it had given her back her capacity to believe in grace. As she circled the courtyard, she found herself at the spot where the old Rossini crest was carved into the stone arch. She brushed her fingers over it and whispered, "You kept your promise." The wind answered softly, carrying the faint scent of earth and autumn. For a moment, she thought she heard music, faint, distant, like the echo of a piano being played far away. It might have been memory or something more. She smiled and turned back toward the house. Inside, preparations for the winter festival had already begun. The children were cutting paper stars to hang from the ceilings, and the volunteers were stringing lights along the staircases. The glow of the bulbs turned the hall into a constellation of warmth. Someone had found an old phonograph among the stored furniture, and now it played a waltz that drifted through the house like a heartbeat. The rhythm carried her back to another time, a time she had only imagined when Rossini's family might have danced in this same hall. Now, new footsteps filled that space, lighter and freer, rewriting the music of the past. That night, after the children had gone to bed and the lights were dimmed, Lydia sat alone in the library. The safe in the wall, now permanently open, gleamed faintly in the firelight. Inside it, she had placed one final object, a photograph of all the children taken in front of the mansion, each face radiant with life. It rested beside the silver cross and the toy horse. She imagined Rossini's spirit there, watching, smiling at how his legacy had transformed. Jonah came downstairs quietly, rubbing his eyes. "Can't sleep," he whispered. She smiled and motioned for him to sit beside her. "It's the excitement," she said softly. "Tomorrow will be a big day." He nodded, resting his head against her shoulder. "Do you think he knows? The man who built this house?" Lydia looked into the flames. "I think he does. I think he's finally at peace." They sat in silence for a long while, listening to the fire crackle. When Jonah's breathing grew slow and even, she kissed his forehead and carried him upstairs. The corridor was quiet except for the faint creak of the old boards beneath her steps. In the children's rooms, soft murmurs of dreams filled the air. She lingered there a moment, watching over them, her heart full to the brim. The snow came early that year. By mid-December, the mansion was wrapped in white, its roof glinting under the pale morning sun. The townspeople came to see the decorations, bringing gifts and food, filling the halls with the hum of conversation and laughter. The festival became an annual tradition, a celebration not just of winter but of hope reborn. The house that had once frightened the city now stood as its heart. In the years that followed, the Casa de Luz continued to grow. The trust funds expanded through donations and grants. New wings were added for classrooms, a garden greenhouse, a small art studio. Children who had once arrived trembling and hungry left years later as strong, confident young adults. Some came back as volunteers, eager to give back to the place that had saved them. Lydia aged with the house, her hair silvering, her hands growing thinner, but her spirit remained luminous. On quiet evenings, she would sit by the fire with the older children, telling them stories, not of tragedy, but of transformation. She spoke of the man who built the mansion, of how even a life marked by sin could end in redemption. People are not the worst things they've done, she would tell them. Sometimes the good comes too late for the person who dreamed it, but it still comes. And that's enough. The day finally came when she knew her work was nearly done. It was early spring again, years after that first cold morning when she had arrived with nothing but hope and 2 frightened children. The trees were budding, and the fountain sparkled in the sunlight. She sat in her favorite chair by the library window, Rossini's notebook resting open in her lap. The pages were yellowed now, the ink fading, but she no longer needed to read the words. She carried them within her. As she gazed out at the courtyard, she saw Jonah and May, now nearly grown, guiding a group of new arrivals through the garden. Their laughter drifted up to her like a song. She smiled, her heart swelling with quiet pride. The legacy would continue. The house no longer needed her. It had its own pulse, its own life. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of crimson and gold, she walked once more through the mansion. The walls seemed to glow in the fading light, the air thick with the scent of wood and warmth. In every corner she saw echoes. Children running, volunteers painting, the faces of those who had come and gone. She stopped before the safe, touching the cold edge of its door. Inside, the photograph of the children still rested beside the cross and the toy horse. She whispered a single word, "Thank you." The next morning, the children found her sitting by the window, her hands folded in her lap, the notebook still open beside her. She looked peaceful, as though she had simply fallen asleep. The fire had burned low, and the first light of dawn filled the room. They did not cry at first. There was too much stillness in her expression, too much serenity. When they finally did, it was not out of grief but gratitude for the woman who had turned darkness into sanctuary. The city mourned her passing quietly but sincerely. The newspapers called her the Lady of Light. The Casa de Luz continued, expanding year after year, funded by those who had once doubted her. The mansion remained what she had made it, a beacon for the forgotten. In time, a plaque was placed beside the fountain, engraved with her words, "Even the darkest house can learn to let the light back in." And when the wind moved through the ivy and the evening sun cast its last glow across the windows, some swore they saw her there, just for an instant. A figure standing in the doorway, smiling, the light of dusk wrapped around her like a blessing. Whether it was memory, imagination, or something beyond, no one could say. But one thing was certain, the house she had saved would never fall silent again. The fountain whispered, the walls breathed, and laughter rose from within, carrying forward the light that remained. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We've got even more unbelievable true stories coming next. Share this video with someone who loves a good twist and stay tuned. The next one will blow your mind.